is that from Thorin?
Right, one of the things, you've referenced it earlier, but in CSGO, I mean, you basically had retired from CS, so there was no, like, threat early on. Like, I remember you played, like, as you say, in Team Acer, funnily enough, with Crystal, I think, from memory, right? You had, like, you had a few smaller teams. In fact, actually, in early CSGO, I noticed all the people were active, but a lot of people were in, like, semi-mixed teams, or you play, like, just an online league or something. Was there a moment when you actually realised, like, CSGO is going to be something for me? Because it sounds like you weren't really committed at that time. You were just playing for fun almost, right?
Yeah, it's crazy. From 2012 and 2000 to 2014, I barely touched CS. I think I played it less than 10 hours during those 2 years. I was completely off CS for that time. I was solely focusing on my studies. I didn't really think I was going to go back, mostly because the CS scene was very small back then. I mean, if you go to active players on that Steam statistics site, it's like 50,000 or something.
Right.
Yeah, it's like super low. But then Crystal, the player you mentioned, sort of reached out, and we started just playing some mixes together, and I sort of realized that CSGO was quite fun, right? That it had become a lot better than it was in 2012. So I think it was in the end of 2014 where I actually started playing it, right? But like the matches we had versus, FNATIC and those teams in 2015 with Team Acer, which was our sort of fun friends team, I had less than 500 hours played, which is like, in hindsight, is crazy.
In that case, what is the story? I mean, you said a little bit about how they've been losing, but how then do you go from barely being in CSGO to you get to be the coach when coaches were barely a thing, of NIP, like a giant org? How does this deal come about?
Yeah, I think there's two things. Like, I was very nervous, and I was thinking the same thing. Like, I felt like crazy imposter syndromes. Like CSGO, I'm going to join NIP, the most legendary teams, and I'm like looking at them, was like, how do you default on this map, right? But I think it was just a trust from, especially GetRight, a lot of credit to him, and also Xizt, because I had been his IGL, that they sort of felt like I will work very, very hard to keep up with other teams. They knew that, and they all trusted me, right, with my CS knowledge, and that was what they were looking for back then. And they sort of maybe also realized they needed a more tactical style, because they couldn't keep up with even Swedish team back then, like FNATIC, who did, out-frag them back then.
I mean, I hadn't even thought of that aspect, but I guess actually that must have been a big deal for you, Threat, because when you're someone who's put as many hours as you did in 1.6 watching demos, thinking, it'll become a big part of your identity, that my thing is being really knowledgeable about the game. So if you're not, I can see what you mean. It causes you sort of to question your identity in a way, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And those first few weeks when I got home from Japan was absolutely crazy. Not only, I was actually still going to uni. Oh, wow. I mean, I would probably regret this now, but it's, I worked from 7 a.m. till 10, 11 p.m. every day. And like when we flew to events, I studied for exams. I mean, in hindsight, it's very, very nice, because now I have a degree and we did some proper results. Yeah, but during that time, it probably wasn't that healthy. But maybe that was the reason as well, like that they picked me, because they knew I would do the work to keep up with the meta. Because also back then, it was way easier to keep up with the meta. Doing it now would take way longer, right? I couldn't spend 2 weeks and then, be on track of the Virtus Pro of the world today. Like back then, as I said, like people were a bit more lazy when it came to these things.
I obviously have to ask you about Xizt, because if people don't know, look, his wasn't as extreme as Carrigan's, but he did his own bizarre transformation. So when we're talking in 1.6 about H2k and these teams, that was Xizt, the star player, who was like, he's like an aggressive rifler who's doing all crazy plays and had all highlight clips. Whereas, yeah, in NIP, obviously, he's more known as the in-game leader. Now, the funny thing is, it's kind of like what you said earlier about when a new game comes out, because I remember when CSGO first came out and NIP was winning literally every single map, people used to think I was hating on Xizt, because I was like, I don't know if he's actually better than Existence, guys. Like, Existence, you can see the strat, you can see he's called, he must have done research. When I watch Xizt play, I used to just think like, well, he's obviously fragging people and he wins clutches. Yeah, he's good, but like, they kind of do what they want in this team. It seems like everyone just runs and kills everyone. Like, they were one of the most ridiculous teams ever on T-side. So what do you think of his progression? Who is this guy? It must be very interesting to come and meet him again when he's an IGL later, right?
Yeah, I even go back to Crystal, the player we were talking so much about, and this is not the German Crystal, so people know that. It's like the Swedish one. And I think he brought Xizt up for discussion back in like 2008. We started playing online tournaments with him, and back then he was like this super tiny, super shy guy didn't like go to LAN, because I do think back then it was some sort of a little bit of a social fear for him. And if someone told me back then that he would be the head coach of my team, that would be absolutely mental, right? And we will be traveling the world. And then he started playing a lot with us in a mixed team called Aimbot. We did some like really good results. A lot of people accused him of cheating as well. And then I think it was in 2009 he joined H2k, which I eventually joined. It's funny, they actually replaced Pronax with me.
Okay.
Yeah, which is funny today because a lot of people probably know who Pronax is, but he wasn't as big of a name in 1.6. And I IGL'd him for a couple of months, and then he was obviously picked up by FNATIC quite quickly because he was ultra talented. And back then he was this very shy, didn't talk, he wasn't very communicative in game. So him becoming the IGL was probably not natural for him. But being in that team for so long, playing so many good teams, eventually, like, it will catch on. And that's sort of the same thing with Kerrigan, right? You're not born to become an IGL. It's going to be very tough in the beginning. And it's usually these weird circumstances that makes you into an IGL. And I think Xizt definitely is one of those.
Yeah, actually, since you referenced the Pronax point, if people don't know, the weird thing about Pronax's success in CSGO is, in 1.6, the Swedish scene was seen as like, tier 1 is like Khan plus whoever the SKIGL is, Wally or Robban. And then you and Pronax were like the level below, and you had the same story. You would both have like star players, they would get recruited, you'd have to keep battling back. But when I think about it, if I think about how much crazy success Pronax had in CSGO, all those majors he won, it actually makes me wonder, what if you had just been an in-game leader from the beginning? Like, you could have had something comparable, right? Does it make you wonder what could have been?
Oh yeah, definitely, all the time, right? I was definitely one of the person that hated on CSGO too much. I mean, there's also this like famous tweet from Sonic, right, that he made. I don't remember what he said.
It's something like it would never be as big as 1.6, which now obviously sounds really silly, but at the time it was really small. Like you said, it wasn't actually as bad when he said it, guys. It was a totally plausible take at the time.
Yeah, I think if I had the motivation, I would probably have made a decent run into the like 2014, 2015. But I also have to be humble to the fact that I was getting older and I was never crazy skilled at the game. I don't think I'm talented. I just think I worked really hard and got good enough individually that like having me as a tactical leader was still like worth it for the teams. That's sort of how I got my worth. But I think it would be very hard for me, like getting into like the 2015 era of CSGO.
When you guys in NIP, when you took over as the coach, got in pyth as the 5th player, he's actually one of those players I want to ask a question about, which is, at the time, I used to be really mean about NIP on my shows, because I would always say, because they had the original 4 that had done the 87 and 0, if you remember, if people go and look, there was a lot of different players that were just the 4 plus the 5th guy, and it started to look like what you call like a rotating revolving door. Like essentially whoever's in the 5th position, when they go down they get kicked. And not only that, it looked a bit like when you join NIP you just get whatever spots are left over. So it doesn't matter if, like, I mean, if people don't know, pyth before he joined, when he was in orbit, so he was actually like an up and coming player, he was like a promising talent. But again, it felt like whoever joined the team often got made to be sort of like a supportive element or something, or they didn't get their positions right. What was there some vision of how you were going to use pyth in this sense? Would you agree with that characterization in general? Had the team before you kind of been a bit like cynical with how they recruited people? What do you think? 'Cause I feel like this was a reputation people maybe thought about with NIP at the time.
Yeah, it was very much a player-controlled team back then, right? They made the calls, and I mean, obviously I helped when I joined, but I don't really know like why they removed Alu, for example, because they had some very good results with him. The same with IGL in the end of 2014. I think it was mostly like social reasons, because they sort of actually goes back to the the 1.6 SK NIP era, where these groups in Sweden that was actually sort of a bit born on IRC, where you had these channels where there would be like this very, very clear, like, okay, you are a player that hangs out in this channel, you're a player that hangs out in this channel, and like penetrating that social group, I think was hard for anyone. And it's not like they're mean or anything, but with Fifflaren, they sort of, everything was clicking socially. And I think they always were looking for that again. Right. And I think that was the issue. And I don't really blame them for that either. Like, if you had it once, you think you can get it again. I mean, today, I think we've reached a point where obviously you want people to be friends and have good chemistry, but it's not really like you don't really need to be best friends and call each
sure.
other for a beer after like you got out of a tournament, right? So I just think it was different times, and they were looking sort of for a new fifth Thorin.
And what about when Pitt came in the team? What was the vision of how you were going to use him as a player?
It was kind of hard because we did want to speak Swedish, obviously, because he had Alu, and there was sort of this weird mix between English and Swedish. So we wanted a Swedish opper, and back then, well, sort of the joke is still that there are no like really good Swedish oppers. Like we have Nok now, but that's like one.
Yes.
And back then, it was JW. Michael Lelle had already been on the team, and they like didn't want to continue with him. So then we sort of looked down the list, and it was looking very, very bleak. I remember we like even discussions like, should Forrest maybe op? Like, what should we do?
Sure.
But Pyth back then, he was like a super talented player. He wasn't the main op of his previous teams because he used to play a bit with Delpan, I remember as well.
Right.
But he would be secondary opping, and you could clearly see he had that, crazy, FPL skill in him. So we're sort of like, what the hell? He is crazy skilled. We have already 4 really good players. We have a good foundation. We're all like quite a bit older than the rest of the scene. Let's give him a shot. And I think for the first period of the time, I think it worked out.
People might forget this detail now, but when there was the MLG Columbus major, famously, you had to stand in, and the team managed to make top 8 still, but you had to stand in and you played Navi, you made the final, etc. Right? The detail people might not know is it was basically just there was like some weird visa issue that Pitt has. So when he arrived, like they just wouldn't let him in and they couldn't play the tournament because there was also some like weird rule, like if he doesn't play the first game, then he can't play any game or so. Because I believe he arrived, right? It was just a few days later. And so give me the story on this, because I always thought like, one, it must be weird you had to play again after all those years off, and then two, like we'll never know how the team could have done at this tournament because it was kind of a bit handicapped. You didn't have the real lineup, right? I imagine you practiced. It was amazing. You must have boot camped and everything, right?
Yeah. We were we were in the city of Landskrona in southern Sweden, a very small town where Extrafy still have their offices there, and they had like this very, very nice boot camp area for us. And it was during the boot camp, like just 1 week prior to the event, that sort of Pyth was like, oh, I need a visa because of some, I don't want to go into details, but it was like a prior visa issue for him, because otherwise as a Swede, you can literally just enter the US.
Yes.
You just needed something called an ESTA, but he couldn't get an ESTA. He didn't get a visa, and sort of similar to players I talked about like FaZe, he wasn't maybe the most like organized person. This became a huge problem, and he didn't actually go at all at the end because he wasn't allowed to play at all. And we still thought even 3 days into the boot camp that he could go. So 3 days into the boot camp, we sort of realized, okay, he can't go. He just went home. I went from my coach PC to his PC, and I just started playing, right? Which is crazy. So I had, I think it was 2 or 3 days of practice in Landskrona with the team, and then we went straight to the
Were you
major.
getting wrecked in the practices? Were you having a hard time individually? Was it hard?
It's actually really funny, because I had some like crazy clutches, and because Pyth was opping, and I was like, we were like laughing, and I was like, I'm just gonna play op this scrim. And we had this Inferno scrim versus Navi, where I don't know, miraculously I played super well with the op. It doesn't make any sense. And for some stupid reason, then I decided like, yeah, I'm just gonna op at the major, So yeah, and I actually did. I got the total amount of 0 kills with the op. Guardian outpeaked me once, and then I never played the op again. So that was my major career with op. But yeah, it was crazy that we even qualified, because we went up against Nico, right?
Sure. Exactly. No, by the way, the reason why I actually think it's so mad that this story happened is because obviously it was like a week later you guys won this DreamHack Malmo with Pitt back in the lineup. So I always wondered, like, what if that real team had been able to go to the major? It would be interesting, right? I'd love to run that experiment back if I could.
Yeah, I think why we did so well both in Columbus, because I think we did, considering I was playing, because I was like, especially when we played Nav on stage, I was absolutely atrocious, which I should be compared to those players, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And then we won Malmo. I think we had been cooking so much stuff for all the maps. Like they used to have Cobble as their perma veto, if I remember correctly. And then we had cooked up so many new strats on that map. So we just like picked it out of the blue versus mouse sports, and absolutely demolished them on it. And having saved all of that, and if we would have been able to use it at the major with the full lineup, who knows what would have happened, right? I don't know if we would have beaten Luminosity, which was the team to beat back then, if I remember correctly. But I think we would have made the grand final, and it would have been a crazy story. Because, I mean, we did show ourselves at Malmo, and even at Pro League later that year, we only lost to Luminosity. We had some really solid rounds, and online, we were, like, unbeatable. Because back then, you played Pro League and something called ECS, which was, like, Facet's league. And we were, like, number one ranked in both of them for the longest while, where we were in super good shape.
Give me some thoughts on this Malmo event, because I remember one of the cool things was this was one of the, I think actually was the first DreamHack Masters event. So if people remember, because DreamHack already was sort of slipping a bit down compared to ESL, they made DreamHack Masters to kind of be their equivalent of, like, you know, IM Katowice or IM Cologne. And they purposely made it, if people don't know, the stadium it's in is like a fucking baller stadium in Malmo. Like, it's really big. Like, it looks like it's an American sports stadium, basically. I don't know if it's a hockey arena. Is it a hockey arena? Is it?
I think it's used for a little bit of everything.
Oh,
like
concerts and stuff,
like
right?
that,
Okay.
yeah.
But anyway, it was like a proper venue. And I remember going to this event, and mate, if there was ever a time for, of all the brands, NIP, like the ultimate one that all the Swedish fans loved, there were so many Swedish fans at this event. And because of this result at the major, and the fact, like you said, in 2015, the team had dropped off a bit, no one had any expectation. Like, the idea NIP even makes the final would have been crazy. The notion you win it is like some of a movie, mate. Like, this actually had like a really surreal feeling, I remember, because I remember it was almost like a movie. Like, every result you had, it was so many close games you had to win in the playoffs, and every time you won, it's like the fans were like believing more and more and more. And then when you actually won the event at the end, it was like, what even is this? Like, what the fuck? So give me some thoughts. It must have been wild to be on this roller coaster, as it were. What was this experience like?
Yeah, it was a true Cinderella story from start to finish. We actually started off losing to Dignitas. I think they were called
with MSL on them.
Yeah. We got demolished. We started CT on Overpass. I think we got 3 rounds at CT, and then we lost the pistol, and we lost 16-3. We were one match from being eliminated on last place, right? And I think we sort of realized we weren't playing like we did in practice, like this crazy style that we've been cooking up. And we started off playing, I think it was like Lord B's team. They had this, you know, with this second best Polish team at the time. We beat them quite convincingly on cash. And then we played Astralis in a, you know, super important match. The winner goes to the arena. The loser is out in the group stage. And we managed to, like, barely scrape that win on Train, I remember, on the final map. And it was sort of at that point we realized, okay, we beat Astralis. And this is, and it's not prime Astralis, but it was still like a, you know, Kerrigan, KGB device, Dupree, like a very, very, very
top
strong
5
lineup.
team. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think at that point we sort of like looking at each other like maybe some magic is going on here. Like, what the hell is going on? But I think it's a combination of, I hate to say NIP magic, because NIP magic seemed to come when we always work the hardest. And I do think we work the hardest before those events.
Right.
Yeah, you're always the most lucky when you work hard, right?
Yes.
But the stars did align a little bit, because when we played Navi in the final, I mean, we beat the Poles in the semifinal, but I've always had quite an easy time in CSGO with the Poles. I don't know why. It's sort of the thing where like some teams beat some teams.
Sure.
So we 2-0 them in the quarterfinal. Yeah, and then we played Godsent. We 2-1. We actually lost a map to them.
That was close, yeah.
Yeah, that was a very, very close match. That would have been completely heartbreaking. That was also the breakout match for Lecro, for those let's remember. But then when we played Navi, who, even though they lost the major final to Luminosity, they were the best team in the world back then. And we went up on Dust 2, a map they were heavily favored on. And of course, it goes 16-14 to us, right? It's like we have these crazy clutches. Getright and Forrest doing, you know, their crazy clutches in the like they do in the finals. And then we headed into our map pick of Cobble. And I mean, even though it was 16-14, I still felt like that map was a bit more comfortable for us, because that had sort of turned into our comfort pick. And yeah, it was probably the best win. It definitely was the best win of my career. And when I talk to Forrest still, I do think he considers the biggest win of his career, right? Emotionally, at least.
Sure. I mean, that's actually, by the way, that's a pretty crazy statement if people consider it in its context. Forest won loads of fucking majors in 1.6, he won everything. So, you mean because of the idea, like, you didn't think he could win, but then it gradually people started to believe in it? Or, yeah, it's like the sort of, yeah, you say the emotional aspect of the journey is what's so satisfying. By the way, for someone like you hadn't won many tournaments in your career at this point in time. Also must be a big deal to win, like, a giant international tournament in Counter-Strike. Even if you're I mean, actually more so, because as you say, you were the coach that could IGL as well. It's supposed to be kind of dope, right?
Yeah, I mean, outside of my standing in at MLG, this was the first time for me on a big stage, like to coaching, right? Because this was our first tournament with pyth. I mean, we did go to Katowice, but we had like 3 days of practice, so I don't really count that. So that was absolutely surreal. The entire arena was filled with players or people with NIP jerseys. Everyone was cheering for us. It's sort of like sometimes I can become a bit nostalgic, like I want to get that again. But at the same time, I have to realize I'm so lucky that I got to experience that, like the full Cinderella story. There's not many people that get to experience that in their life. And I'm like, especially now that I'm the GM, I realize I won't get that thrill again, which is fine, right? Because I did get it once.
By the way, when you were the coach of NIP in this era, right, obviously, like we're saying, you had a massive impact on the game because you could talk while they're in the game. But were you actually someone where, did you get kind of like comparable control to being a GM now when it comes to roster moves? Was it still players who would make the call? How did that sort of thing work?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think we were like 3 or 4 people in NIP, and it was sort of like everyone does a little bit of everything. Even the players would jump in, right? It was... like coming from that era, it's so hard to talk about like roles. Like now you have the head coach and the analyst and the GM and blah blah blah. Back then you were the coach, but you were literally the GM. You were the analyst. You were the performance coach. Yeah, you were the manager. You had to get them food. You had to make the schedule. Like everything, you had to do literally everything, which wasn't optimal, right? I do think I got a bit burnt out there at the end of 2016, but there were no resources to hire more people.
People might remember, these are still the years where if you go back, Forrest is still pretty good at this time. He's not the best player, obviously, but like considering how many years he is a career, he's still like a very dangerous player, and he could definitely have series where he could be the best player. How did you try to use a player like that? And at this point in his career, how was he like receptive to coaching? Was he a guy who had his set way he wanted to play? Was he open to new ideas? What was it like to work with him?
I think Forrest has always been quite open to new ideas. He always wants to have sort of his style. Something I like about him is that he will tell you if he doesn't like it. That is actually a big issue with younger talents that we bring in even to NIP to this day, where they just say yes, 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 and then afterwards they're like, oh, I feel really uncomfortable doing this, and it's like, yeah, you should have said something at the start, right? So I do think me and Forrest, we had a really good working relationship. I would throw ideas at him. He would accept a few of them. He would try out a few of them. He was always open to trying things. He could be a bit stubborn in some ways, I guess. Like there are some, infamous chats we had. I always joke about this with Freiburg, where Forrest always wanted to peak Silo on CT Nuke versus Ecos. And I'm like, we're playing, like Nico with a deagle. Can you just please don't peak there? Like it's so unnecessary. But all in all, I think he was one of the older players that still was very open to my crazy ideas. And to be fair, I can come up, people don't see this. You see some crazy ideas we do in officials. That usually means we've done 10 that failed in practice, right?
By the way, you brought it up earlier, but this was obviously the era where I always make fun of Get Right at Forest, because a year before, bro, when they were 2015 and the results were going down, that's when I used to say, because I actually came up with the term Nip Magic, when I used to say that on the desk, and look, I'll admit now, I was sort of doing it a little bit as a backhanded compliment, because what I was sort of saying was you won, but fuck knows if I know how you did it. Just be luck or something. I was sort of doing that. But the reason I always thought was funny, the reason I used to make fun of them is because a year later, when you came along and they were winning Malmo and that fucking Star Series with Makalili started, and then IM Auckland over SK, none of these results are supposed to happen. And the joke is by then, even they embraced Nip Magic. They were all yeah, it's sort of just Nip Magic, lol. And then I'd be like, what the fuck? But was there something about this team? Because this actual era, if people remember, was the era when it was almost Nip Magic. Like, this wasn't like they were the best and they won. It's like actually people didn't think NIP was the best, but they could somehow win events still. So what do you think was the quality of this team that allowed it to do this? Because like I say, those events I referenced there, like, you weren't supposed to win the Star Series. That was the event team in the world there. As I say, when you beat SK Gaming at IM Auckland, they were actually the number one team. They just won the last two majors. Like, these kind of are miraculous results. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I have to be completely honest, there are definitely some variance to that as well. Whereas, like, if we would have simulated that event 100 times, would we have won over 50? I don't know.
Right.
But apparently enough that we actually won it in our reality, right? Yeah, I think it's a combination. Me and Xizt, I mean, he was, this was actually when they had removed coaching. So Xizt was calling, and I think we built a very, very solid system that made us still... We always overperformed if you looked at our lineup because we had a very solid system. And we also had two of the best performance in important matches, which was Get Right and Forest. So when we played those matches, they would probably overperform a little bit. And we had the solid system, and that made us be able to beat, well, we obviously anyone, because we did, right? And then people would translate that into, you know, NIP magic. But playing on stage with that lineup, I definitely think we were like a top 5 team.
By the way, one thing I wanted to ask was, if anyone goes and looks, over the years, there was like a period of like, was it like a year and a half where you're not listed as being with NIP, but the rest of the time, almost from 2016 to basically now, it just depends what role they list you as. Sometimes you're the coach, sometimes you're the assistant coach, you're the GM now, obviously. Like, give me some thought. Like, was there a period, like, there was a period where you went away? Were you always involved other than that?
I think at the beginning of 2017, and a little bit, I didn't actually go to one of the events we won. I think it was Star Ladder with Michael Ellen.
Right.
I wasn't there. Because as I said, like when I got back from Japan, I did both university and like Malmo, Columbus, everything. And I realized that was a bit too much, you know, basically working to 250%. So I sort of told them, like, I can't go to all of the events. I will skip some of them, put some extra time into school, because I was 1 year away from finishing my master's. And I know if I don't do it now, I will never do it, and I will probably regret it. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to skip these few events. Maybe that's why they sort of changed a little bit. Why? And I mean, at the start of 2017, I had to finish my master's thesis. So I did focus on that. I went to like DreamHack Masters Las Vegas, I think. Okay. That was the only event, but I didn't work with them for most of that time. Like when they brought in, they only had Draken for a while,
right.
For example. I wasn't really working that much with it. And it wasn't until we brought REZ we brought REZ in June 2017, where I went back into full-time head coaching.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, I want to ask about this era, because obviously this was when some of the moves were made, that all of a sudden it wasn't just that 5th spot. There was some positions where people started to gradually move, and obviously one day there was no NIP original players. So one of the players that you referenced there, although as you said it wasn't when you were full on, was when they brought Draken in. Right. I actually think that when people look back, I feel like he's one of the most misunderstood players ever, because I actually remember when that Epsilon team came up and loads of people were raving about a bunch of their players. Like the main one actually fully wasn't even Draken, it was Disco Doppler, if you remember. Everyone used to be like, wow, this guy's crazy. But I remember watching the demos and watching Draken and be like, this guy's really good though. Like, he actually probably should be. Again, as you said, there was no Swedish AWPers. I was like, bro, this guy has to be on like FNATIC or NIP. Like, he's clearly got the skills. And people know, because it became a weird meme in NIP. Everyone thinks the meme of him is he could hit all the like crazy like 98-degree shot this way, but then he'd miss like what you call like a sitter in English, where it's like right in your crosshair, you know, like the most basic AWP shot anyone would hit. But it's sort of true, but I don't think people realise that meme, even though it's like kind of a bit mean, it's also kind of true. Like, he clearly did have like a lot of skill, and actually I know that even in personality wise he was like a bit of a cocky guy in some ways. Can you give me some thoughts on Draken? Because I feel like sadly, because his career didn't do much after that, people just think he was bad or something. Like, he's just a very like a difficult player or something. What was he like? Give me some thoughts.
I mean, as you said, he played in Epsilon, and they had the up-and-coming Swedes back then, like REZ, Disco Doppland, and yeah, Draken. And Draken back then, he was, like you said, a very, very cocky player, and also incredibly skilled individually. And that was what we were looking for. We had struggled so much time to find like the AWPer that would make the space for the team. So Draken was like not only the obvious choice, but like I think the only choice back then for us. Like, so we picked him up. And I do believe he showed some really insane individual skill during his time in NIP. And I also think as soon as we got REZ instead of Freiburg, he felt a bit more comfortable. Because once again, it was sort of that issue of having the same 4 players all the time. And this has nothing to do with Freiburg, to be honest. Like, you probably could have removed anyone, and then all of a sudden you have 2 new players. That changes the entire like social dynamic in the team, because it's not that group of 4 anymore, right? They've changed it. So I do think it really helped bringing in 1 new player when we brought in REZ. And it could probably have been sort of anyone, exchanging anyone, but it was a long time overdue, right, at that point.
Dude, there's a thing, I assume within an IP, everyone's thought about this recently. There was a thing where I think it was actually like last year, I looked this up once, and I was like, dude, REZ has been in an IP a long time. I looked it up, and I'm pretty sure he's actually now the player that's been in it the longest. I think he was in longer than Forrest at this point in time, because I think how many years he was there since like 2017, like we're talking about. So that's obviously like a big signing, because he's now been there through all the different versions of an IP. Who is REZ? Because he seems like someone where from the outside, my assumption has to be one of the reasons he's also been able to stay in the team isn't just talent. It's that he appears to be willing to do any role he is asked to do, and he's changed through many different lineups and roles and he's even been in the international team. So give me some thoughts on this guy. Must be an interesting player.
Yeah, so when we picked him up, he was like the rifler in Sweden to pick up. He was just crazy skilled. He had that, now it's a meme, it's like 500 BC MVP of IM Oakland, right? That I watched on Twitch at. But back then, he was just a young kid, crazy aim. Like you could see, he has this sort of crisp, almost like scream type of tapping, right? That you see in very, very few players. Like mechanically, he's insanely gifted. And as you said, right, he is very easy to work with. He will just do what you tell him to do. Something he was bad at back then is what I just said with players that don't say when they are uncomfortable. Now he's much more vocal. He is actually someone that would have benefited of being more cocky, like Draken, for example.
Right.
But he's always been like a solid team player. I don't really know how he was when I was away from NIP, because I was away for 2 full years from that lineup. But when I came back in 2020, he was, I think, probably the best player in the team still when I joined, right? So he's just a very, very solid piece. And it's hard to move a piece like that. It's like you need to have a very good reason, especially now as a GM. Like, it's like if you get a donk type of level player. Otherwise, it's like, if we change REZ, would that make the team better? No, probably not. It's always the answer. And that makes him stay in the team, right? Because he's also very good socially with everyone. Yeah, very easy to work with, and like no problem with, working very long hours.
I don't know if this was actually during your time with him. I think, sadly, it might actually have been maybe in the time you were away. But there's even a detail about REZ that a lot of the public don't know, because I remember seeing this. I have a very good memory, obviously, which was at the one point in time, he said he had bad wrist injury because he used to have one of those really fucked up grips where it was like, like sideways or something insane. And obviously, like if you're an aimer like they are with like that whole style isn't like the big mouse pad. It's like all the wrist thing like that. And like everyone who's played old school games like Quake knows, like you can injure your wrist really badly if you do that style loads. And one thing that's really impressive is I saw that he actually, because he had an injury, he didn't just do the thing where you take a month off then play again through pain. He actually literally changed his whole style of aiming with the mouse to be like a normal style. And I'm pretty sure if you do that, by the way, it probably makes your game go down a little bit initially. It'd be like changing your shot in basketball or something. Like, it's a pretty big thing to change. But he not only changed it, but as far as I know, like since then he got really good again. Like, actually, that's kind of cool, dude. I've seen so many pros over the years with a fucked up setup, but I can tell you they're all scared to change it because they all know, like, what if I get worse for the next like 3 months, or what if I'm never as good? They have that fear in the back of their mind. Was this during your time? Because I think that's quite an admirable story for like young players to some degree.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it wasn't during my time, but I think you sort of figured out what makes him really, really good. Is he doesn't see problems. He always tries to find a solution. A lot of players would actually just complain about the pain. And then they go to see some, physiotherapist, and they just tell, like, do these exercises every morning, and they will do some, half-ass thing a few days, and then they get bored, and instead they go up and, have a Red Bull every morning. He is so disciplined, right? He is so disciplined. He literally takes ice baths every day.
Fucking hell, like an actual like MMA fighter or something. Holy shit, okay.
Yeah, because it's like, oh, this can increase my focus. I want to be better.
Right.
I will try it, right? And then I will continue doing it. He has no problem with doing it. So, like, very, very healthy guy. Like, he really takes care of his body very well. And it's, I think, eventually, sort of like in golf, right? Where eventually we're gonna see only those type of people that is in very good shape. Because it was for a long time in golf, people could be, you know, overweight. They weren't in good shape.
Sure.
And then Tiger Woods came along. It's like, if I actually care about the small things a lot, like really care about them, that will make me 2% better. But it turns out like those 2% is everything as like the actual top.
Right.
And I think it might take a bit longer to get there in CS, but I think that's the future we're heading towards.
When you came back to NIP was obviously like almost just before the whole world went to online play. And then most famously, it was in the era where, if anyone saw my Hampus interview, the notorious... I mean, the sad thing is to me, he knew he's calc because he's from 1.6, but they all know him as Jonas Gunderson, obviously, who was like the CEO of the company. And not only that, but he not only made a lot of decisions, it turns out, according to Hampus, but he obviously kind of branded himself as the face of the team. He also was kind of like the guy out there, like, it's my era, my sort of reign, I'm doing these things, right? Obviously, you were working with him at different times in this role as a coach. So I think, what was your experience like? Like, was some of the moves weird ones? Because it was made to sound in the Hampus interview like maybe you didn't even get to make any decisions. Maybe you just had to sometimes put your name, like sign as it were, but it was him making the decision. What was it like? What was your experience?
I think I was partly part of the decisions, though I definitely, or I know he would overrule me, because he was the type of GM that took control when he wanted to decide the roster decisions of the team, right? And he did obviously listen to me, and actually, sort of like Hampus said, I did listen to that interview. He's like a crazy good salesperson. I mean, one of the reasons I went back to NIP was I had a sick job in IT back then in 2018, 2019. I was very, very happy. They took very good care of me at that company, right? And he called me and magically convinced me, right? And like all of a sudden I'm in an NIP jersey, right? So he definitely had some strengths, but I definitely think he... Yeah, I mean, let's actually talk about Jonas, because I think it's very, very interesting. And it's been the hot topic of this year and 2023 as well when I took over. I do think, first of all, I really dislike when people talk about this in the community. Sometimes I think we just need to remember that we're talking about esports and Counter-Strike, which is an entertainment business. Like me and Jonas, well, especially at the end, we disagreed on a lot of things, even like led to him firing me, right, from NIP back then. But that doesn't mean like he's a terrible person or that I hate him. People need to put these like...
Right, there's a bit too much soap opera aspect, I see. Right.
Yeah, exactly. We live in a world with like wars. It's like we disagree on how to run a Counter-Strike division. It's like I could still go out and have a beer with him, right? Because people become so hateful sometimes. He's not like some scam artist is trying to trick you. He truly believed that what he was doing was right, and I believed I had my other vision, that what I wanted to do right. And I think like one of the things we disagreed on the most, right, is like who runs the team. I still believe it is the head coach that runs the team. That's the only way to hold them responsible for the team and being accountable for the results. Like if you don't make the decisions, how can you be responsible, right? That's sort of how I see it, right? And he made some weird roster decisions. I do think that is also a bit overplayed because he did a lot of good things as well. Like he really pushed for building that young ninja squad. He got Device into the team. Yeah, I also think it's actually weird because the narrative in the community is like when we got the young ninjas into the team, it's like, oh, then we played worse. But we have to remember 2020 personally is my worst year ever as a coach or player. Like it was terrible. So at the start of 2021, it was either like, can we get, Brollan or Crimps? Like Brollan or Crimps, we had like this list. Like if we can get one of them, we will just get them. Okay, we can't. Should we continue with the same lineup we did in 2020? Like, no, that would also be crazy, right? Because we had some, very, very poor results. So he really pushed for some drastic decisions with picking up, very, very inexperienced players. And it actually improved our results tremendously. Even before we picked up Device, when we had the Knock instead of him, like if you look at it on paper, we had like ZTR, Knock, Plopsky, Hampus, and REZ. And I think I even heard Knock say this in an interview. Like we truly overperformed with that lineup. I think we came third in Pro League, like narrowly losing to Gambit.
Yep.
And we lost to Heroic, and we showed.
And this is when Gambit was the best team completely, right?
Yeah, they were just trashing everyone in that online era, and it was like we were up there with those teams. We beat Big, who was like doesn't sound like a big deal now, but they were literally number one in the world for a long time. So we were insanely good as soon as we brought in ZTR, and then it's like, was it ZTR or was it like the other players? Like, what was the reason? I personally believe like just getting a young player that is so hungry compared to that old Swedish lineup we had in 2020, that was the difference maker. Like, would we have played better if we got, Brollan or Krims? Yeah, probably. But, like, we also live in reality. Like, would I want Saiwu for free? Like, yes, sure. Like, yeah, that would be very, very nice, right? But we couldn't. And we made the most of what we had. And when you're, like, we had to be a bit desperate at the beginning of 2020. And then doing that sort of gamble pick of ZTR was, like, actually a good decision. However, then changing him to LNC, that is probably the mistake we made, right? And this is actually nothing against LNC. If we would have started with LNC, I would have said the same thing about changing him to ZTR, right? It was just rather that we changed. Because we were super solid with that team. We had a hungry player. We had Device. And if you look at the results, like, I don't really buy the narrative that we were playing so good, in spite of having like a proper player. But we shouldn't probably have changed lineup in after Flashpoint where we came second. I do think that was probably, and I was part of that decision. I don't want to like put this solely on Jonas because I was also on board with that back then. But I don't, as I said, right, I do think bringing in young Ninjas players did help us. But obviously they were, I don't even, if ZTR and LNC is watching this and I said like, oh, if we would have brought in Krims, would have done it. Yes. I don't even think they would be mad about it that time either, right? Like, we gave them a shot. They were still like a young Minas player. There weren't really any other truly good options in Sweden back then. Not to sort of be quoted again, the famous quote, Sweden has no talents. I don't know if you read about that. It was also misquoted right now. It sounds like I'm only defending Jonas. I mean, this is coming from the person that disagreed with him to the extent that he removed me from NIP, right?
Sure. I mean, one thing I would say is this. I know what you mean. Like, first of all, a thing that a fan will never know is Jonas is one of these people who just comes off way better in person. Like, he's the person, like you say, if you met him in a bar for a drink, he'd be way more charismatic than you think. On paper, on text, that never comes across. So I think people only know his decisions. And then also, I agree with you. Like, it's not as simple as he was just bad and all his decisions were bad. Like, I actually think one of his problems, if you ever look at the time he was there, was if you look at the big picture, if I just read off this list of names, these are all people he signed. Device, by the way, Device is like, some people think he's the GOAT. Like, that was like a mega play. Yeah, Alexi B, one of the best IGLs in the world. Brolan, you did get Broy eventually. Fucking, I mean, even Config's a big name still. Like, these were massive. The problem he had to me with that was this. They weren't all at the same time. They were like, they were spread out, and it was always like, the roster always felt like, this is why people will criticize the young ninjas. It always felt like they were one player away, But if you look at these big names, like, these are great players to sign. It's not all in the same lineup. The team never came together, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly. And I think something that adds to this young ninjas narrative that we like kept changing every week is the Device situation, which sort of like, obviously we will pick up the offer from young ninjas.
Of course.
Yeah, because it literally happened mid-tournament. So we have to, by the rules, do that. There is literally, even if we wanted to, like, okay, I could have played with AWP like I did in Columbus, like, probably not a good idea, right? And even then, we came to the final of IM Winter. We beat G2. This is something that's so weird about narratives. Yeah, so a thing with narratives in the esports community is they get more extreme over time. This is probably true with narratives in general, I think. True. Where we started, at the end of my coaching career, like, NIP was held in such high regard. Like, before the Stockholm major, we were actually ranked second in the world.
Yes.
And for most of that year, we were like top 10, top 5 even. Like, we were a contender for the title. Like, obviously we weren't the favorites, even though we actually had the highest seed of that major. And Navi was the clear favorites, right? But we were truly up there. And then when we lost the quarterfinal to G2, I think we also mentally bought into the hype. I did as well as Jonas, right? Where we bought into that, like, we are NIP, we are supposed to win majors, even though we were actually on a very good trajectory at the time. And then I also think this was a poor decision to pick Xizt. Even though Xizt in the future was a good pickup for another lineup, at that time, having that young ninja, I think we underestimated that sort of hunger that gave us. So we probably should have kept Linus. And I mean, at the same time, we made a quarterfinal and we were like top 5 in the world. And you look at the NIP's results after that, right? It's much better. And not only that, I get replaced as a coach because obviously I didn't win the major. We had a lot of pressure on us. I mean, I put a lot of pressure on my coaches now. Was it the right decision to replace me then? I don't know. But that seemed like the good idea back then, right? So he replaces me with DGL. I have more of an analyst role back then. It's a bit vague, that entire 2022 year for me. But I work quite closely with the team for the first half, and we have a very good working relationship, me and DGL back then. And still throughout the first half of 2022, we have some decent results. And at the Antwerp major, right, we managed to get
could have won that one. Yeah, that was the double.
Yeah, exactly. We were 1-1 in maps versus FaZe in the quarterfinal. We beat Cloud9, which was the super Gambit lineup in the group stage. We beat Vitality with Saiwu in the group stage. And we were 1 map away of making the semifinal, beating the eventual winners of the entire tournament. And still, when you talk to people now, the narrative is NIP has been shit for so long.
Yes.
And we just missed, winning tournaments, and that's obviously on us, and should hold the coaches accountable for those things. But this narrative that it was so long ago that NIP went to shit, I disagree with completely. I think when it fully went bad was going international during the summer of 22. That was when we had the very bad era.
Yes. No, I know what you mean. If you hear the way people characterize it, you would think NIP came last at every tournament. Whereas, as you say, not only was the ranking good, and by the way, the rankings are based on placings, but there was way more top 8s and top 4s than people remember. Along these lines, though, that's why I would pivot it to what I was asking about there. I feel for me, the frustration was always more on the angle of the lineup's almost really good on paper, and it's they just have to figure out that one last player, or who's the IGL or who's the AWPer, right? The obvious exact angle that I need to ask you about now, because we can talk about it years later, is the device thing, right? One of the reasons people might be shocked, because I was famously someone who was a big fan of Device when he was on TSM and Astralis, right? But then people thought I was a hater of him when he was in NIP, because I used to be quite critical of the fact, well, where is he? It's one thing, look, I'd heard the stories that he has things with his mental health, and he's got to, the doctor says he has to take time off. That's one thing. But I always wondered, if you know the esports industry, if something like that is totally set, usually orgs will just announce it. They'll be hey, this person has to take 6 months off, or they're going to be inactive. You bench them, you bring another person. Because that never happened, and it was basically, I knew what Hampus revealed, which is that even the players in NIP were he's coming back next tournament, isn't he? And they just never did. And it really was a year. After a year, people were what the fuck were we waiting for? I thought was it like that from your perspective? Did you keep thinking he's coming back next event, or in 3 months, or in a month? Because if he ever had have joined any of these lineups, I feel that would have been the complete lineup. Right? That's when you maybe could have won something.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if we had the lineup we had with the Deve, but then we would have had Brolan, who eventually joined, right? Yes. Then we would have had, I mean, it might sound like cocky, but I think we would have had a shot at winning the Stockholm Major, for example. Yeah. I think that wouldn't have been impossible, right? But yeah, it's such a weird scenario, right? And it started at the end of 2021. Mid IM winter, I sort of knew that something was going on with him. And in hindsight, I do think I handled it quite poorly. I was also very, very stressed and upset about the entire Stockholm Major, because as NIP, that event was built up to the most ridiculous extreme.
One thing I should say here, right, just so people understand the context, is because it was in Stockholm, Sweden, and it's NIP, that was also a big deal, right? The idea we're playing in front of the home crowd, and in fact, it's even if people don't know, it's like Globen Arena, which is an iconic place. So I imagine it was a lot of pressure in that regard, right? The org expected results, I imagine, or even maybe to win the major, right?
Yeah. I mean, I've never worked as hard as we did back then, and we had Mahone in the team. I remember we spent so many hours. We did this crazy thing where we would actually prep every single possible map against every single possible opponent in Swiss, which means you win one match and you lose, and you don't know the result in any other match. So we listed literally everyone we could meet, went through every veto, what they could pick, prepared every map, And then we were almost the first team to ever 16-0 Astralis, thanks to that. We were like 16-1. We did 16-1, and we lost a 1v3 versus Lucky out of all players, right? Which is this crazy story. Yeah, anyway, we put too much pressure. We probably shouldn't have worked that much because, right, it didn't really translate when we eventually played on stage regardless. So I think we built that event up too much. I did as well. And during the same time, obviously, the Device was going through a lot of things, which means he acted in certain ways where, like, wasn't that nice, right? I knew he would agree to this.
Oh, sure.
I assure you. And as I didn't know this, and I was also very stressed, it became like this perfect storm, right? Where I was extra annoyed by every detail if someone was late or anything, and he was in that very bad space. So I think that sort of created this like weird rift between us, and it didn't really feel like it was working out in the end. And I don't, like, now I know everything, right? So I absolutely don't blame him, right? And I like something I do apologize if I acted up during that time as well, because I was so stressed during that period of time. But who knows what could have been if we had him in the lineup in 2022. It's sort of weird. I probably would have, maybe I would be coaching still if that was the case.
Sure. Yeah. Everyone needs a support network, and mine is, of course, my Patreon community, the Scrominati, who in many ways, they're the Sonny to my Cher, saying, I got you, babe. So this video and all the others on my channel were kindly supported by the following names: Ahmed Hadju, Mac Pugnaccio Rakula, Adam Tomlin, Animosity, Jensen Go, Tosh, Toucan, and you know it. Jerky's Minion, my main man, always going to be referenced, one of the best patrons of all time. Would you like to ask a question in my AMA? Maybe you want to suggest a topic or a guest to say on my channel? Do you want teasers, find out who the upcoming Reflections and Talk to Thorin interviews are? Maybe you want to do one of those long discussions where you get to set the topics we talk about. Well, if any of these or others appeal to you, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Scluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.